Now, you might not want to raise your hands, but I'm curious. How many of you have a tattoo? I don't. Oh, can't raise my hand. My good friend Lillian got her first tattoo when she was 80 years old. So if you were thinking that you are too old to get your first tattoo, you are not. She had just 3 words tattooed on her arm. And the words are, nevertheless, she resisted. Now, I looked those words up this week because I knew that sentence had a story to it, and I couldn't remember exactly what it was. And if you look that phrase up, you will find out that Elizabeth Warren in 2017 was on the Senate floor, and she had brought some words of opposition to a candidate that was nominated for Attorney General. And as she was speaking, sharing all the reasons why that person was an unfit candidate, she also shared from a letter written by Coretta Scott King, another relentless widow, just like the one in our story today. And as she shared those words, Mitch McConnell got a little bit upset. He didn't like her saying bad things about one of the senators, the one that was nominated. And so he warned Elizabeth Warren to stop talking. And then he found out about a rule. There was a rule that he could use, and he did, and he got Senate approval to silence Elizabeth Warren. And what Mitch McConnell said to cover his tracks, so to speak, to explain his actions was, she knew the rule, she was warned, nevertheless, she persisted. And that sentence went viral. Every feminist group in the United States grabbed those 3 words and ran with it, including my good friend Lillian. Now, this all reminds me of the widow in our parable today, but before we unpack that parable, I want us to think about what a parable actually is. About 3 weeks ago at a Michigan conference meeting, another Lillian in my life, Lillian Daniel, shared that a parable is not a fable. A fable has a one-line meaning or a moral, a takeaway that everybody can hold on to. For example, the tortoise and the hare. What is the moral of that parable or that fable? Anybody know? Slow and steady wins the race. Anybody who hears that story will know that's the moral. But a parable is a sacred story, and it does not have one meaning that is the same for everyone. In fact, I like to say that parables are like a box of chocolates. You just never know what you're going to get. You might read it today and it says one thing to you, and next year you might read it again and it says something completely different. So, the very first line that Linda read for us in Luke chapter 18 said, "Then Jesus told the disciples a parable," which instructs them basically to pray always and never give up. Never lose heart. I want you to disregard that statement, that one sentence, because Jesus goes on to tell a parable that says something completely different. So I think probably at one point a scribe or the author of this gospel read the words of Jesus, and that's what this parable said to them, but it might not be what it says to you. So let's see what it does say. All right, let's take a look at it. Now, in this story, many of you have heard it many, many times. We have a widow who is crying out for justice, and we have a judge who is unjust. He cares about nobody, not God, not other people, no one but himself. And this widow is relentless. When the judge goes to work, she is there saying, "Give me justice." And when he goes to the market to get some bread, she's at the market saying, "Give me justice." And when he gets home at night, she is waiting on his front porch saying, "Give me justice." And when he opens the mail, there's a letter from her and it says, "Give me justice." And he gets worn down, according to our translation, and he gives in. Now, I want to share with you what the Greek words are there, because the Greek, which is the original, does not say that she wears him down. The Greek says that she strikes him below the eye or slaps his face. She's giving him a black eye. He's starting to look bad. He's got to do something about this woman. And she has been relentless. He would not listen to her for the longest time. Nevertheless, she persisted. And then he finally had to do something. Now, this story is funny. I can't tell that from looking at all of you, but it was funny. Imagine Jesus telling this story to the disciples. Everybody knows an unjust judge. Everybody knows a politician who cares about nobody but themselves. And everybody knows a woman who is ready to tell you like it is, whether you want to hear it or not. And nothing's going to stop her. And so as you see these two going at it in the story, and eventually who wins? The one who shouldn't win. The one who has no power. The disciples have got to be cracking up to imagine this little gal going after this powerful man. Now let's look at these two characters a little more closely. They are complete opposites. We have a male and a female. We have a person of privilege and a person who is marginalized. A widow in that economy had no hope for survival unless she had family to take care of her. She is completely vulnerable, completely powerless, and he is powerful and privileged. They are as different as they can be. Now, what does this story say to us? The common interpretation of it is exactly the first line of what Linda read for us, that if we just pray long enough and hard enough, God will eventually just give us what we want. As if we are all spoiled brats, and we can just throw a tantrum, and if we throw it long enough and loud enough, that God will finally cave. Does that sound like God to you? How is that working for you? Because that has never worked for me. And I'm not saying you shouldn't pray long and continually and persistently. But I don't think that our constant prayer is going to wear down a God who doesn't want to do anything for us. That's what it sounds like. Now, in order to understand this a little bit better, let's look at a couple of examples that are closer to our place and time. Let's go back about 100 years, and let's talk about Alice Paul. I've talked about her here before, but it's been a long time ago. Every time a female in this place goes into the voting booth to cast a ballot, you should be thanking Alice Paul. How many of you have heard of her? 2. Awesome. We got 2 people who have heard of Alice Paul. Alice Paul was a suffragist. She worked constantly so that women could have the right to vote. She dogged the steps of President Woodrow Wilson. He could not turn around without finding Alice Paul in front of him asking for the right to vote. She found an office across the street from the White House, so that every time Woodrow Wilson looked out his window, he saw her window and her suffrage flag. She started a newspaper and hired a comic strip artist to make funny cartoons about Wilson. She got 1 million signatures by traveling all around the country. This is the early 1900s. She travels all over getting over 1 million signatures in favor of women's right to vote. She organized suffrage parades. She had activists around the White House waiting there with signs every single day, Monday through Saturday, 9 to 5, in all kinds of weather for a year, confronting Wilson every time he went in and out of those gates. She was detained. She was arrested. She and her other activists were strapped into straitjackets. They were sent to jail. They had no due process. She went on a hunger strike while she was in prison and was strapped to a table, and they shoved a tube down her throat and force-fed her. And she would not quit. He would not listen to her, but nevertheless, she persisted. Now, what happened was the press found out what was happening to Alice Paul, and they began to leak the stories, and it was giving President Wilson a black eye. He was starting to look bad. So he had to change his course enough to begin to think about women's right to vote, and eventually, all of this resulted in the 19th Amendment. And so you can thank Alice Paul for being persistent for 7 years to get that amendment passed. Now I have another example for you, and this is from today. Today, there is a 22-year-old Swedish woman named Greta Thunberg. Anybody heard of her, I hope? Yes, more. When she was in grade school, she heard about climate change. And she thought to herself, it cannot be true. Because if this was really true, then all adults would be panicking. Everybody would be working on climate change because we've got to do something. And nobody was panicking. And so she thought it cannot possibly be true. But she continued to educate herself. And she found out it is, in fact, true. It is happening. And so she began to school strike. Every Friday, instead of going to school, she would go to the Swedish Parliament, and she held a sign in all kinds of weather, all day on Friday, all by herself, calling attention to climate change, asking for the Swedish Parliament to take action. And she was there alone for many, many Fridays. Eventually, more students began to join her, and then more students began to join her. Their parents weren't too happy about it. But the students stood with her outside the Swedish Parliament, and then other nations began to see school strikes on Fridays. And now it is an international movement all over Europe where students are not going to school on Friday, they are going to their governments, and they are holding signs asking for attention to climate change. Now, Greta Thunberg has spoken to the United Nations, and she has talked to the leaders of the world saying, your house is on fire. Do not tell me that you care about your children because you are doing nothing, which tells me that you do not care about them. We must act now. She brings this message over and over and over again, and no one listens. She's been doing this now for 7 years. No one listens, nevertheless. She persists. She's also written a book so that all of us can be educated about climate change, because it's going to take everybody. Now, we have these examples. We have an example of a widow. We have an example of Alice Paul, a suffragist, and we have an example of a young woman who is still crying out for climate justice. What does this parable say to us in our time and place? The widow has her own issue, doesn't she? We don't know what it is. She says, I want justice, give me justice. But we don't know what her justice is, but it's for her. The suffragists were campaigning for women, and their issue was the vote. And Greta Thunberg is campaigning for humanity, for the planet. That is her issue. So today, as we look at this parable, what is it saying to us today? What is our issue? What is it that the church is facing? Now, when I was in my Healthy Congregations class on Wednesday, the instructor said something I did not expect. He said, the biggest problem facing the church today is that the church is taking on the anxiety of the world. Let that soak in for a minute. That we have taken on the anxiety of the world. Let's remember what this church is about. Not this church, but the whole universal church. It started in little homes under great persecution. Nevertheless, they persisted. It saw the formation of an institution. It saw things like the bubonic plague and the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition, all kinds of events. Nevertheless, she persisted. She saw the Civil War. The church was here during the Great Depression. The church was here for the Great War and the Second War and COVID. Nevertheless, she persisted. Why is that? Because she knows, and we know, that we are the keepers of the sacred stories. That we know God is not like the unjust judge. God is like the God that Jeremiah talks about. The God who is always present with us. The God who is always ready to help us. The God who journeys with us and is faithful to us and shows us that there is still hope. There is still hope for a better world. And that hope does not go away, even if we don't get to see it. We are the holder of that hope for the world. And when the church takes on the anxiety of the world, we forget. We forget that we have a God who is with us, who supports us, who holds the hope for us so that we can see that there's a better way that we can be. And it is not too late. It is never too late. So this church should be a place where people can come to get away from the anxiety of the world and come here and get their tanks filled. Because it's hard. Life is hard. Times are hard. Anxiety is high. But if we can come here, if the church can remember who she is, she can persist. And if she has persisted through all of those other things, this is nothing new. We hold the stories. We say the words. We sing the songs. We follow the ritual and the liturgy. And it grounds us. It grounds our spirits. So I want to leave you with a question. My friend Lillian told me just this week, she says, every day I have to read my arm. Nevertheless, she persisted because it gives me courage. So when we look at this congregation, what are the words that will give us courage to keep going? What are the words that we need to share with the neighborhood to let them know that they can come here and we can take some of their anxiety and stress off them and give them some words of hope and fill their tank? What are the words that we might tattoo on our arm to give us courage every day? What are the words you need to hear? Because the church is going to persist. She has persisted for that long. She is going to continue. And what we are going through today is nothing new. Now I want you to take a minute. And as we close our eyes, let's just ask the Holy Spirit now to speak to our hearts. What are the words we need to hear? What is the feeling we need to have? What is it that we can share with our community so that they can find relief from their anxiety?